Imagine being hired to pour the foundation for a, a massive multi-million-dollar mansion. You do all this backbreaking work, right? The concrete dries, the framework goes up.
Right.
And the very next day, a law is passed making it totally illegal for you to ever step foot on the property again. I mean, you built the value, but you are barred from the house.
That is the exact paradox to the Salinas Valley.
Exactly. So welcome to this deep dive into episode 10 of the Rethink History series, Salad Bowl of the World. And this installment is called The Hands.
And you're about to hear a very measured documentary account of a really profound historical pattern. It's the story of people who were desperately needed and then systematically legislated against.
Yeah, it's a deep structural loop because over the first 9 deep dives we've done in this series, we've looked at every layer of the Salinas Valley's agricultural bowl.
We've covered the drain sloughs, the sugar beets, the iceberg lettuce.
All the market machinery, exactly. But, none of that infrastructure means a thing without the fuel to run it. And that fuel was a massive, cheap, movable workforce.
And the premise here is unavoidable. Every single time, a new wave of labor arrived to supply that need. They were followed by a law.
A law specifically designed to restrict them. So today, we're going to trace the 8 distinct waves of hands that built the salad bowl. We want to measure the growers' stated economic needs against the reality of what the workers actually got.
And that pattern establishes itself right away with the first wave, the Chinese laborers in the 1870s and 1880s.
Because the Salinas Valley that you might picture today, perfectly flat, ready to farm, that just didn't exist naturally.
No, not at all. Around the town of Salinas, there were these massive sloughs and seasonal swamps. And it was Chinese crews who performed the brutal physical labor of draining them.
Just incredible physical exertion. And because of that, land values didn't just rise, they absolutely exploded.
Right. They engineered the very ground that the valley's wealth was built on. They worked the early beet fields under contractors, and they built a real community.
They founded the first Chinatown, right?
They did, which later had to move to Soledad Street after a major fire in 1893. But the reward for making that land so valuable wasn't a stake in the valley's future.
It was a legislative wall.
Exactly. In 1882, the Federal Exclusion Act comes down, and it firmly closed the door behind this specific workforce.
Okay, let's unpack that for a second. It's like my mansion analogy earlier. By barring entry, the law prevented the labor pool from replenishing itself.
It cut off their future entirely.
Okay.
But here's the thing about agriculture. The law might ban the worker, but the crops don't stop growing. The beets are still in the ground.
Right, so the Exclusion Act creates this instant labor vacuum. The growers still desperately need hands.
And that vacuum pulls the Japanese immigrants into the valley as the second wave. They begin arriving around 1898.
This was for Spreckels sugar beet fields, right?
Yeah, exactly. And their trajectory is really stunning. They don't just remain a movable labor force. They use this deep agricultural knowledge to move from field work into tenant farming.
So they're actually running the farms now.
Right. Eventually, they're growing a massive share of the valley's vegetables. They're operating on a minority of the land, but producing just incredible yields.
But I'm stuck on the mechanics of this. I mean, if you're a local grower and you see these farmers pulling massive yields, why trigger a backlash?
Because the laws they passed were incredibly surgical. We are talking about the Alien Land Laws of 1913 and 1920.
Surgical how?
Well, the law didn't stop them from doing the backbreaking labor. It stopped them from building wealth. It barred immigrants who were ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land.
And that phrase specifically targeted Asian immigrants.
Right. And later, it even barred them from leasing it. So it strips away their autonomy, but keeps them trapped in the system because the valley still needs their expertise.
Wow. Which sets the stage for a devastating collapse of civil liberties later on, because in the spring of 1942, these families spent 69 days locked behind wire.
Right at the Salinas rodeo grounds. The local fairgrounds were converted into an assembly center.
And from there, they were loaded onto trains and shipped out to the Poston incarceration camp down in Arizona.
To really understand the weight of those land laws and that displacement, we need to follow one family's journey all the way through the timeline, the Tanimuras.
They are widely known today as this ultimate Salinas Valley success story, right?
They are. But we have to pause here and correct a major historical myth. Even the company's own history claims that they lost their farm during the war.
Wait, they didn't?
No, based on the historical archive, that is factually untrue. They never had a farm to lose.
Oh, because of the alien land laws we just talked about.
Exactly. The father, Ejiro, was strictly forbidden from holding a deed. So in 1923, to farm the night ranch at Castroville, he had to lease it through a legal proxy.
A Hawaii-born U.S. citizen named Jack Hayashi, I think?
Yes, and the family later sharecropped for a local shipper. They had to use these complex legal workarounds just to legally touch the soil.
So when the trains took them away in 1942, what the war actually took wasn't a deed.
No, it was a leasehold, a standing crop, and 18 years of meticulous work.
That is just staggering. And the son's journey through this is wild. George Minoru Tanimura, born at San Juan Bautista in 1915.
Right.
By the time he's 20, his father dies, and George is suddenly running about 100 acres and caring for a dozen brothers and sisters.
And then comes the incarceration at Poston. Federal records place at least 15 Tanimuras in that camp.
There's actually a surviving photograph of George playing on a camp baseball team.
Yeah, and he was married inside Poston in 1944. But, their return to California wasn't some warm welcome.
Far from it. In 1943, the town of Salinas polled itself on whether to let these Japanese families back in, and the poll yielded exactly one yes vote.
One vote. So when the Tanimuras returned, they didn't go back to Salinas. We have to rely on family testimony here, not archival records, but they say they worked as farm laborers in Gilroy first.
Right. It wasn't until 1947 that they bought 20 acres at Aromas, which was the very first piece of ground the family ever held in its own name.
From there, the trajectory just rockets upward. Sometime between 1948 and 1952, the exact date is unsettled in the sources, they start selling lettuce to Bud Antle.
Which leads to a massive partnership formed on the 10th of November, 1982.
But we should note that partnership wasn't with Bud, who had died a decade earlier. It was with his son, Bob Antle.
And by 2017, they become this massive employee-owned company. It sounds like the ultimate triumph over an unjust system.
It's an incredible arc, but we have to immediately withhold the moral here.
What do you mean? Does that not erase what happened?
Well, the historian Sandy Leighton points out a really crucial caveat. The Tanimuras possessed deep local farming knowledge, and they already knew how to work around the land laws.
Oh, I see.
Right, but not all internees had similar outcomes. You have to look at the state plaque at the rodeo grounds. There are 3,586 people listed on that plaque.
So one family got the triumphant ending, but the vast majority did not.
Exactly, and we absolutely cannot let one family's victorious arc stand in for the thousands of people who lost everything.
That is a sobering reality check. Now, we're going to move to the fourth wave, and this is a piece of the timeline that is almost never told. We're going to take this slowly.
Yeah, it involves a desert shrub called Guayule.
Guayule.
Yeah.
And it yields natural rubber.
Right. And by 1941, the only cultivated Guayule fields in the entire country were in Salinas. 8,000 acres and a processing mill grown since about 1926.
And this suddenly becomes a massive geopolitical issue because Japan takes Southeast Asia and cuts off roughly 90% of America's natural rubber supply.
The U.S. government panics. On the 5th of March, 1942, Congress passes the Emergency Rubber Act. They buy the Salinas plant, and overnight, Salinas is the headquarters of the National Emergency Rubber Program.
Run by the Forest Service, right?
Yes. Now, hold the calendar perfectly still here. It is April 1942. A Caltech scientist named Robert Emerson carries Guayule cuttings out of that federal project at Salinas.
The sources differ a bit on how much. One says a burlap sack, another says 14 gunny sacks of discarded cuttings.
Right, but he takes them up to the Manzanar incarceration camp.
Inside Manzanar, incarcerated Japanese-American scientists build a rubber laboratory.
On camp wages of about $16 a month.
$16 a month. And they produce rubber that totally beat what the government was making back in Salinas. More than twice the yield per plant, and it was stronger.
They even published 3 scientific papers from behind the wire. But look at the timeline back in Salinas. Those cuttings left in April 1942. On the 27th of April, the Assembly Center at the rodeo grounds opens, locking up the valley's Japanese families.
They're sent to Poston.
Yes, where the governor actually forbade this exact same rubber work from happening, claiming it endangered public safety.
That irony is just, it's heavy. The government is desperate for rubber, but the people who know the soil are locked away.
And it leads to a deafening silence in the historical record. Our sources show absolutely no record of any Salinas Japanese American ever working on the Guayule project.
It's just a link of cuttings and terrible timing.
But the silence goes deeper. Nobody has published who actually did work those massive 8,000-acre Salinas fields during the war.
Wait, really? Nobody knows.
No marker exists.
Mm.
The program ended in 1946. 10,000 tons of rubber were destroyed. For a deep dive entirely about hands, finding a blank spot regarding who provided the labor for a massive federal project is a major finding.
It really highlights who is kept invisible. But, as the Japanese families are removed, the valley still needs hands. Which brings us to the fifth wave, the Filipino manongs.
Because the Philippines was under U.S. rule, Filipinos were legally American nationals, so they were exempt from the immigration quotas.
And throughout the 20s and 30s, young Filipino men were cutting and packing the valley's lettuce.
But unlike previous waves, they organized very quickly. In 1933, they formed the Filipino Labor Union, and in late summer 1934, they went on strike.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They are legally American nationals, but they are met with vigilante violence just for asking for better pay.
Yeah, Rufo Kenny's labor camp was burned down. Hundreds of men were driven out at gunpoint.
But they understood a fundamental mechanism of the valley, right, the harvest window.
Exactly. The growers had the guns, but the manongs knew the lettuce was highly perishable. The growers had an incredibly narrow time window before the crop rotted.
The workers had the leverage of time.
And that leverage held. That autumn, despite the burning camps, they won. They secured recognition and a wage of 40 cents an hour.
Right around this exact same time, the 1930s, the sixth wave is arriving, the Dust Bowl families.
Migrants fleeing ecological disaster in the Midwest began settling in the Alisal district east of Salinas.
And it's fascinating because this is the exact same autumn that Salinas-born John Steinbeck was writing about these migrant workers.
The national narrative he was crafting was unfolding in real time in his hometown. But the labor pool shifts again, bringing us to the seventh hands, the Mexican crews, and the Bracero era.
Now, there is a deeply complex, decades-long history of strikes and legislation from 1942 to 1975.
We aren't going to retell that entire arc today. That specific strike and law arc is actually handed off to the sister series, The Politics of Produce, episode 13.
But we have to anchor this Bracero era to a single tragic marker to really understand the vulnerability of these hands.
Right. On the 17th of September, 1963, a flatbed labor bus was struck by a freight train at a crossing in Chualar.
And when we say bus, we mean a flatbed truck fitted with benches and a canopy, just packed with farm workers. 32 people died.
It is a stark reminder of how the people brought in to move the valley's wealth were treated, frankly, as cargo.
Which brings us to the present, the eighth wave. Because the demographics have shifted again. Today, the agricultural workforce in the Salinas Valley is increasingly indigenous.
We are talking about Oaxacan workers speaking languages like Mixteco and Triqui. And the legal structure is shifting rapidly, too.
Yeah, over the last decade, the guest worker visa program has risen roughly fivefold in Monterey County.
And we have to look at how the H-2A visa functions. An H-2A worker is legally tied to the single employer who sponsored them. It removes the free market leverage from the worker.
To understand the reality on the ground right now, we have the University of California Santa Cruz report of 2026, Dignity in the Fields.
And the findings on housing are staggering. Nearly all farm worker households are overcrowded.
But, to remain strictly impartial here, we have to set that reality directly beside the grower's case. We want to give their perspective its full weight.
The agricultural industry argues they're dealing with highly perishable crops, narrow harvest windows, and severe ongoing labor shortages.
And some firms have invested heavily in structural solutions, right? Like Tanimuras and Antol spent $17 million building dedicated employee housing.
It is a deeply complex modern web. Carol Lynn McKibben's history from Stanford is a really useful counterweight here.
She analyzes the myths on both sides of the divide.
Right. She finds that modern Salinas is undeniably more inclusive than it once was. But she also notes that historically, the city maintained a quiet system of white supremacy, managing the labor force without actually sharing the ultimate power.
I think the most striking summary of this modern tension comes from the series compiler, Nick McKenzie.
Oh, absolutely. He provides this very brief clinical observation. Since 1988, he has worked as a physician in the valley.
And he says he's seen both the people who own the fields and the people who cut in them sitting in his exam room.
Right, and he notes simply that he has seen this entire story from both chairs, and neither chair looked comfortable.
That really strips away the urge to assign simple villains and heroes. It forces you to look at it as a massive churning system.
And if we step back and look at the entire 150-year pattern, the thesis is undeniable. The salad bowl was never a machine. It was always a highly managed labor system requiring immense numbers of hands.
Constantly swapping the people, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Dust Bowl, migrants, braceros, indigenous workers, but keeping the structural design exactly the same.
The need for cheap, movable labor remained constant, and the law was continually used to manage the human beings who provided it.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If the physical labor required to feed a nation dictates that a workforce must remain cheap and invisible, what does that say about the true cost of the food on our plates?
A cost that goes far beyond the price tag at the grocery store.
Exactly. And the history of this valley is far from over. In our next deep dive, episode 11, titled 1936, 61 Days, we'll cover the massive shed strike of that autumn, tear gas on Main Street, and the hearings that followed.
Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.